I still remember the first time I realized people weren't laughing with me, they were laughing at me. It was a sound that cut sharper than any insult, because it wasn't just one person, it was a ripple, a wave of chuckles rolling across a room aimed squarely at me. I was 16, sitting in the back of the cafeteria with my tray of overcooked pasta and watery fruit punch, clutching the straps of my backpack like armor. I had worn a thrift store dress that day, something my mum had patched up carefully with her tired hands, thinking it looked retro. To me it felt like dignity, like I could show up and still hold my head high, even if we didn't have much. But to them, it was a joke, and they made sure I knew it. The whispers started, then the pointing, and then the laughter. My face burned so hot I thought the cafeteria lights had turned into spotlights just to humiliate me. I remember pushing food around on the plate, pretending I couldn't hear, but every laugh lodged in my chest like a stone. That moment could have broken me. Honestly, for a while it did. I went home and cried into my pillow, the seams damp with secrets I never told anyone. My mom asked if I was okay, and I just said I was tired. Tired was always easier than explaining that your soul felt crushed by something as simple as laughter. My dad was working late as usual, 2 jobs just to keep us afloat, so I had no one else to notice. I started wearing plain clothes after that, nothing that could stand out, nothing that could invite those cruel eyes. I thought if I blended in enough, maybe I'd disappear into the walls and finally get some peace. But of course that wasn't how it worked. When people sense weakness, they go for it. My quietness became another joke. My silence, my reluctance to join in, all of it just painted me as an outsider they could pick apart. What they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was that in those moments of isolation, I was quietly building something inside myself. Every cruel laugh, every mocking glance became fuel. I started to escape into books, into late nights writing in a battered journal that no one else knew about. I filled it with thoughts, dreams, and stories of who I wanted to become. I would sit on the floor of my tiny bedroom, knees pressed up to my chest, and scribble under the yellow glow of a chipped desk lamp. My room smelled of laundry detergent and my mum's vanilla candles, and it was the only place I felt like I could breathe. I wasn't powerless there. On those pages, I was someone who mattered. Still, the world outside didn't let up. By the time I was in my early 20s, the pattern of being underestimated had become almost routine. At work, when I spoke up in meetings, my ideas were brushed aside until someone else repeated them, and suddenly they were brilliant. I remember standing in front of the copy machine one day, holding back tears because my boss had literally laughed in my face when I suggested a new process to save time. "Cute idea," he said, and walked away. Cute. Like I was a child playing dress-up instead of a woman working twice as hard to be taken seriously. That word burned more than I let on. But here's the thing. I never stopped. I kept writing. I kept learning. Nights when my co-workers were out drinking, I was home watching tutorials, reading business books, teaching myself skills no one thought I was capable of. They laughed, but I was building. Brick by brick, word by word, late night after late night, I was constructing a version of myself they would never see coming. And deep down, I promised myself something. One day the laughter would stop. One day I'd make them choke on it. I carried that promise inside me like a secret flame that no one else could see. Even when the days felt endless and the nights heavier than I could handle, I held on to the idea that all of this humiliation would one day have meaning. I remember walking home from work in the freezing rain, shoes soaked through, my cheap umbrella flipping inside out from the wind. People in their cars passed by, warm and dry, and I imagined them looking at me, the drenched girl on the sidewalk, and laughing again. In those moments, when the world seemed determined to keep me small, I whispered to myself that they didn't know who I really was. They only saw the surface, and the surface had never told the full story. My apartment at the time was nothing more than a cramped studio with peeling wallpaper and a heater that rattled louder than the traffic outside. But it was mine. And in that tiny space I created a world where their laughter didn't reach me. I spread notebooks across the floor, typed late into the night on a second-hand laptop, and surrounded myself with sticky notes full of plans. My desk was a wobbly table from a thrift store, and my chair creaked every time I moved. But when I sat there, I felt powerful, like maybe the universe hadn't counted me out yet. There were nights when I cried from exhaustion, forehead pressed against the cold surface of that desk. But even then I didn't stop, because every time I remembered their mocking voices, the fire inside me grew hotter. At work, the cycle continued. I was the one who picked up the tasks no one else wanted, the one who stayed late fixing the mistakes of others, and still they dismissed me. I'd overhear them in the break room joking about how I was trying too hard, as if ambition was something to laugh at. One colleague even said, not realizing I was behind him, "She'll never make it anywhere. She doesn't have the look or the confidence." I froze in the hallway, coffee burning my hands as I gripped the paper cup too tightly, and for a second I wanted to scream. Instead, I swallowed the pain and let it harden into determination. They could laugh, but I was learning. They could joke, but I was sharpening skills they didn't even know I had. Slowly, piece by piece, I was building a portfolio, crafting a plan, turning myself into someone who wouldn't need their approval. And I kept my silence. I let them believe I was harmless, invisible, a background character in their world. That invisibility became my shield. They thought they knew me, thought they had me figured out, but in reality they were blind. And I knew, sooner or later, the day would come when the mask would fall, and they would finally see who I really was. The turning point came quietly, almost unnoticed, the way the smallest crack in a wall can grow until the whole thing collapses. I had been working late again, my eyes stinging from the glow of the computer screen, when I stumbled on a project no one else wanted to touch. It was messy, disorganized and destined to fail, which is why they pushed it toward me with smirks, confident I'd drown under the weight of it. I accepted it without protest, because I knew something they didn't. I knew how to build order out of chaos. I spent nights tearing it apart, piece by piece, writing notes until my hand ached, and slowly fitting it back together like a puzzle. The office laughed when they saw me dragging folders home in a tote bag that was fraying at the straps, but I ignored them. I survived on instant noodles and cheap coffee, the kind that left a bitter taste in my mouth, but each sip was a reminder that I was pushing through. My neighbors probably thought I was insane. Lights on until 3 in the morning, shadows pacing across my thin curtains, but I didn't care. For the first time in years I felt like I was moving towards something that mattered. When the deadline came, I presented the project with shaking hands, my voice steady even though my knees were weak. At first the room was silent, then I caught the flicker of surprise on faces that had never taken me seriously. The same boss who once called my ideas cute leaned forward in his chair, eyes narrowing, trying to hide his shock. They asked questions, they challenged me, but for the first time I had answers they couldn't dismiss. I walked out of that room knowing something had shifted. They didn't laugh that day, not out loud at least, but the silence was louder than any laughter I'd heard before, because it was heavy with the realization that I wasn't who they thought I was. Of course, that didn't mean they suddenly respected me. No, people like that don't give up their game so easily. They tried to downplay it, saying I got lucky, that maybe someone had helped me behind the scenes. I heard the whispers and felt the sting, but it only pushed me further. I doubled down, kept working, kept studying, kept building the version of myself I knew existed beneath the surface. In the mirror of my bathroom, cracked in the corner and foggy from cheap glass, I would stare into my own eyes and remind myself, they don't know you. Not yet. But they will. And when they finally see, it will be too late for them to laugh. I started to notice the shift in little ways first, like the way they stopped making jokes when I walked into the break room, or how conversations grew quieter when I passed by. It wasn't respect yet, more like unease, as if they were beginning to realize they had underestimated me and didn't quite know what to do with that. I kept my head down and pretended not to notice, sipping stale coffee from the office pot, taking my seat at meetings as though nothing had changed. But inside, I was sharper, more focused than ever, because I knew this was only the beginning. Every night after work I returned to my small apartment and picked up where I had left off, reading case studies, taking online classes, practicing presentations in front of the mirror, while my reflection looked back at me with tired but determined eyes. The neighbors probably thought I had no life, and maybe I didn't in the traditional sense, but I was building one that went beyond anything they could imagine. My walls were covered in notes, goals scribbled on scraps of paper, reminders taped above the sink so I'd see them even while brushing my teeth. I remember standing barefoot on the cold linoleum floor of that kitchen at midnight, eating dry cereal out of the box because I didn't have the energy to cook, telling myself over and over, they don't know who you really are. They don't see what you're becoming. And that thought kept me going. Still, the ridicule didn't vanish completely. One afternoon, I overheard two coworkers laughing about how I was obsessed, saying I had no balance, that I was setting myself up for failure. Their words stung, but I bit down on my tongue until I could taste blood and walked away without letting them see me break. Later that night, sitting cross-legged on my bed with my laptop humming against my knees, I thought about those words and instead of feeling crushed, I felt clarity. They weren't wrong about one thing. I was obsessed. But obsession was exactly what separated me from them. They clocked out at 5 and forgot about everything until the next morning. I never stopped. And deep down, I knew that was going to make all the difference. Slowly opportunities started opening. Doors that had always been closed to me began to crack. A manager from another department noticed my work and invited me to collaborate. Suddenly the same people who once laughed at my ideas were trying to insert themselves into conversations with me, as if they had been supportive all along. I watched them carefully, smiled politely, but never forgot the echoes of their laughter. It was etched into me too deeply to ever disappear. And as much as part of me wanted to forgive, another part promised that one day, I'd make them remember every single time they doubted me. The strange part was how quickly people tried to rewrite history once they sensed the tide was turning. The same co-workers who once mocked my thrift store clothes or rolled their eyes when I spoke up in meetings, suddenly started greeting me with overly sweet smiles, asking about my weekend as if we had always been friends. I played along, nodding, answering politely, but inside I remembered every detail of how they had treated me. Memory was my armor, and I carried it silently. I noticed how my boss, the one who once dismissed my ideas as cute, began calling me into his office more often, pretending to seek my input, though his tone still dripped with condescension. But I didn't mind because I wasn't playing the same game anymore. While they were busy pretending to be something they weren't, I was quietly expanding beyond them, working on projects outside of the office, building a foundation that no one could take away from me. My nights were no longer just about studying or surviving, they were about creating. I designed things, tested ideas, connected with people online who saw value in me without needing to diminish it first. I remember the thrill of my first real breakthrough, sitting alone in that cramped apartment with the heater rattling behind me and realizing I had just landed a contract that paid more than a month of my office salary. I laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because it felt unreal, like the universe was finally rewarding me for all the nights I had pushed through the exhaustion. But I kept it quiet. I didn't brag. I didn't tell anyone at work, because their laughter had taught me the power of silence. Let them think I was still the desperate girl scribbling in notebooks and staying late to impress them. Meanwhile, I was building a life they couldn't even imagine. The mornings became easier after that. Even when I dragged myself onto the crowded bus, the smell of damp coats and spilled coffee filling the air, I felt lighter. I'd watch people scrolling on their phones, complaining about traffic, and I'd smile to myself because I knew I was carrying a secret they couldn't see. Every rude comment, every cruel laugh was beginning to lose its power over me, replaced by the satisfaction of knowing I was no longer just surviving, I was becoming. And although no one else realized it yet, a day was coming when they wouldn't just stop laughing. They'd wish they had never underestimated me at all. The first real taste of change came when I was asked to lead a presentation for a client, something I had never been trusted with before. I knew the others expected me to fail. I could see it in their smirks when my name was announced, like they were waiting for me to stumble so they could have a new story to laugh about. I spent nights preparing, going over every slide until I knew it by heart, rehearsing my words out loud in the mirror until my voice stopped trembling. The morning of the meeting, I wore the same thrift store blazer I had owned for years, the one with a slightly uneven hem my mother had fixed with her careful stitching, because to me it wasn't about appearances anymore, it was about proof. When I stood at the front of that room, my hands shook for only a moment, and then something inside me clicked. I started talking and the words flowed, clear and confident, because I wasn't just presenting information, I was presenting the hours, the years, the nights of effort no one had seen. The room grew quiet in a way I had never experienced before, not with ridicule, but with focus, and I felt a shift in the air, as if they finally heard me. When it ended, the client shook my hand firmly, and said it was one of the best presentations they had seen in months. My boss tried to act as though he had expected it all along, nodding smugly, but I caught the tightness around his mouth, the discomfort in his eyes. And my co-workers, the ones who had laughed at me endlessly, clapped a little too hard, their smiles stiff, like they weren't sure if they should celebrate or fear what they had just witnessed. Walking back to my desk that day, I felt a sense of quiet triumph wash over me. I didn't gloat, I didn't say anything, but in my chest I carried the memory of every moment I had been mocked, every time I had been made to feel small. And it fueled me. That night I went home, dropped my bag on the floor of my tiny apartment, and let myself laugh for the first time in years. Not the bitter laugh of someone who's been hurt, but the laugh of someone who knows the tide is finally turning. I poured myself a cheap glass of wine, sat cross-legged on the floor among my notebooks and plans, and whispered out loud, "They don't know me yet, not really, but they will." And the thought didn't scare me anymore. It thrilled me, because I knew that every step forward from here would only make their laughter sound smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. After that presentation, something inside me refused to go back to the way things had been. I started volunteering for more responsibilities, the kind everyone else avoided because they seemed too messy or too risky. Each time I took one on, I stayed up late, fueled by instant coffee and determination, piecing everything together until it worked. My apartment looked like a war room with papers taped to the walls, lists scrawled across sticky notes, half-empty mugs scattered on the counter, but it didn't bother me. That clutter was proof that I was moving forward. I began to notice how the same people who used to laugh at me started hesitating before making their usual comments. Some of them even began asking me questions, small things like how I managed to organize files so quickly, or how I kept track of deadlines. I answered politely, but never revealed just how much work went on behind the scenes. Let them wonder, let them question. I wanted them to feel the confusion of realizing that the person they thought they knew no longer fit into the box they had shoved me into. I'll never forget one afternoon, when a group of them stood near the copier, talking about a problem with a client, and one of them said, almost reluctantly, maybe she could fix it. It was the first time I had heard my name spoken without sarcasm in that office, and though I acted calm, inside my chest something swelled. That night I walked home in the cool air, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement, and I felt taller somehow, like I wasn't the same invisible girl anymore. At home I wrote in my journal, the same battered notebook I had kept since high school, filling pages with every thought and memory. I wrote about the cafeteria, about the laughter that had once broken me, and I realized those wounds had become my strength. Without them, I would never have built this fire. I closed the notebook, placed it gently beside my bed, and whispered to myself that the world was finally starting to see, but deep down I knew I wasn't finished. This was only the beginning. They still didn't truly understand who I was becoming, but soon they would. And when that day came, their laughter would not just stop, it would turn into something else entirely. Something they couldn't take back no matter how hard they tried. The strange thing about change is how it sneaks up on you. One day you're still the quiet girl sitting at the back of the room trying not to be noticed, and the next you catch someone staring at you, not with mockery but with something closer to fear. That realization came slowly. In the way my coworkers avoided making jokes when I was around, in the way they lowered their voices when I passed them in the hallway. I could feel their unease growing with every small success I stacked on top of the last one. I kept my face calm, my words polite, but inside I was smiling because I knew what they didn't want to admit. They were beginning to regret underestimating me. The memory of all those years of laughter still lingered though. Every time I caught one of them looking at me differently, I would see flashes of the cafeteria, the whispers, the cruel smirks, and I reminded myself never to forget. That memory kept me grounded, kept me hungry. I poured all of it into my work. Nights were spent hunched over my laptop at the small kitchen table, the sound of traffic outside mixing with the low hum of my heater, while I sketched out plans for things far bigger than that office. I started taking freelance projects, sometimes juggling so many deadlines that I barely slept. But it didn't matter. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving their laughter, I was outgrowing it. And with every contract I signed, every skill I mastered, I felt the gap between who they thought I was and who I was becoming grow wider. One evening my boss called me into his office, his voice unusually measured, asking if I'd be interested in leading a new initiative. I could see the conflict in his eyes. Part of him still wanted to dismiss me, but another part had realized he couldn't. I agreed without hesitation, though inside I remembered the word cute he once used to humiliate me, and I promised myself silently that I would never let anyone reduce me to that again. Walking home that night, the city buzzing with neon lights and the smell of food from late-night carts drifting through the air, I felt a kind of quiet triumph that tasted sweeter than anything I had ever known. I knew it was still early, that there was so much further to go, but for the first time I wasn't afraid of their laughter. I welcomed it, because I finally understood that it was never about me being weak, it was about them being blind. And soon, very soon, blindness would no longer protect them from seeing exactly who I really was. There's a certain silence that comes before people finally realize the truth. And I started to feel it around me more and more. It was in the way conversation stopped when I entered a room. In the way my name was spoken with hesitation, not mockery. As though they weren't sure how much longer they could pretend I was the same girl they once dismissed. By then I had already built a small world outside of them. A world of clients, projects, and late nights where my worth wasn't defined by their laughter. I had savings now, not much but enough to remind me that I was no longer standing on shaky ground. My apartment still rattled with every passing truck, the wallpaper still peeled in the corners, but when I sat at my desk with my laptop glowing in the dark, I didn't feel trapped anymore. I felt free. I'll never forget the night one of my coworkers messaged me privately, asking for help with something she couldn't figure out. For a moment I just stared at the screen, remembering how she once laughed the loudest when I wore that patched-up thrift store dress in high school. Now here she was, reaching out as if I were her only option. I helped her, of course, but not for her sake, for mine. Because with every step forward, I wanted to prove to myself that I had risen above the need for revenge in small moments. My revenge was in the bigger picture, in the way their laughter had already started to die on its own. And yet, I couldn't stop the satisfaction that bloomed inside me when I thought about how different things had become. At work, they still tried to play their roles, but cracks were showing. They no longer dared to interrupt me in meetings. They no longer dismissed my words as silly or naive. Instead, they leaned in, taking notes, pretending they had always known I was capable. But I remembered. I remembered the cafeteria, the office whispers, the stinging word cute, and every single tear I had shed alone. Those memories were carved into me like scars, and I carried them proudly, because they were proof of the battles I had fought and won. One night, as I stood at my window looking out over the city, the hum of traffic below and the glow of streetlights reflecting off rain-soaked asphalt, I realized something important. Their laughter had never truly been about me. It had been about their fear, their need to keep someone else small so they could feel big. And now, standing there with the knowledge of who I was becoming, I whispered to myself that I was done being small. They would see me soon, not as the girl they mocked, but as the woman who had built herself from the ground up, and when that day came, their silence would be louder than their laughter ever was. The day everything truly shifted came almost without warning, though looking back I realize I had been preparing for it all along. A major client had threatened to leave, and panic spread through the office like fire. People who had once strutted around with confidence suddenly looked pale and nervous, whispering in corners, pointing fingers at each other. I stayed quiet, watching, until my boss reluctantly turned to me and asked if I could step in. The room went silent. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, waiting for me to stumble, waiting for proof that I wasn't as strong as I seemed. But instead of shrinking, I felt steady, like I had been waiting for this exact moment. I took the files home that night, spread them across my kitchen table, and worked until dawn, fueled by determination and the quiet hum of the refrigerator beside me. My hands ached, my eyes burned, but I didn't stop. I thought about every cruel laugh, every smirk, every time they told me I wasn't enough, and I poured all of it into the work. When I walked back into the office the next morning, exhausted but prepared, I laid out a plan so detailed and precise that even my harshest critics had no words. The clients stayed, not only stayed, but doubled their contract. The celebration that followed was strange. People clapped, they congratulated me, but their voices sounded forced, like they knew they had lost something they couldn't get back. My boss shook my hand, stiff and cold, pretending it had been his idea to trust me, though I saw the flicker of resentment in his eyes. And my co-workers, the same ones who once laughed at me for daring to dream, now smiled too widely, trying to hide the fact that the ground had shifted beneath them. That night when I returned to my apartment, I didn't collapse into exhaustion the way I thought I would. Instead, I stood at the mirror in my bathroom, the cracked glass reflecting a woman I barely recognized. She wasn't the timid girl clutching a thrift store dress anymore. She wasn't the invisible worker dismissed as cute. She was someone else entirely, someone they could no longer ignore. I touched the glass lightly, tracing my reflection, and whispered, "They know now. Not everything, not yet, but enough to understand that the laughter is over." And as I crawled into bed with the city still buzzing outside my window, I felt a peace I had never known before. Because I realized it wasn't just about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving to myself that I had been right all along, that I was always capable, always strong, even when no one else could see it. After that victory, things didn't return to normal. They couldn't. The balance of power had shifted and everyone felt it, even if they pretended not to. Suddenly, the same people who once rolled their eyes at me were dropping by my desk with forced smiles, asking for advice, trying to align themselves with me as though we had always been allies. I gave them polite answers, but inside I never forgot. Every time someone praised me, I remembered the sting of their laughter in the cafeteria, the nights I cried into a pillow in a tiny apartment, the endless hours I spent proving myself to no one but me. Those memories were carved deep, and instead of hurting, they made me stronger. Opportunities began opening faster than I could have imagined. Invitations to sit in on leadership meetings, emails from other companies reaching out quietly, even whispers of promotions that had once been unthinkable. Yet the strangest part was how hollow the office began to feel. Where their laughter had once filled the air, there was now only silence, heavy and uneasy, and in that silence, I heard something better than applause. I heard fear, not fear of me as a person, but fear of what I represented, proof that the girl they mocked had outgrown them completely. One evening, after another long day, I stopped at a cafe, instead of heading straight home. I sat by the window with a notebook, sipping bitter coffee, and watched the rain streak down the glass. My reflection in the window looked older, stronger, tired but certain. I opened the notebook and began writing, not about them this time but about me. About how far I had come, about the woman I had become, about the dreams I still carried. For the first time, my words weren't filled with pain or defiance but with pride. I realized that their laughter had been the background noise of my life, but it was never the melody. The melody had always been my determination, steady and quiet, pushing me forward when nothing else did. I closed the notebook with a firm hand and knew that the final step was still ahead. It wasn't enough for them to stop laughing. They had to understand. They had to see fully who I really was, not in whispers or glimpses, but in a way they could never deny or erase. And as I walked home in the rain that night, shoes soaked through just like years ago, I felt the difference. I wasn't the broken girl anymore. I was the storm, and soon they would have no choice but to face me. The final moment came when I was offered a position far above the people who once mocked me, a role that placed me in charge not just of projects but of futures, including theirs. I accepted it calmly, though inside I felt a fire that had been waiting for this day since the first cruel laugh in that high school cafeteria. Walking into the office as their superior, I caught the flickers of shock on their faces, the way some couldn't meet my eyes, the way others forced smiles that didn't reach their lips. I held my head high, not because I wanted revenge in the petty sense, but because I wanted them to see me clearly at last. The first meeting I led was almost surreal. I stood at the front of the room where I had once been silenced, and this time, no one dared to interrupt. They listened, pens moving quickly across notepads, nodding in agreement, the same people who had laughed when I struggled to find my voice. I spoke with certainty, not because I wanted to humiliate them, but because I had earned every word through years of pain and persistence. Yet still, when the meeting ended, I lingered in the quiet, letting the silence stretch, forcing them to sit with the truth of who I had become. Later that night, back in my apartment, I sat at the same wobbly kitchen table, where I had once cried over instant noodles and exhaustion. The space hadn't changed much. The wallpaper still peeled, the heater still rattled, but I had. I poured myself a glass of wine, opened my old journal, and flipped through the pages, filled with the words of a girl who once begged the world to see her. Tears filled my eyes, but not from pain, from pride. Because she had done it, I had done it. Their laughter had tried to break me, but instead, it built me. I could have chosen vengeance, could have thrown their cruelty back in their faces, but instead, I chose something stronger. I chose to outgrow them. My revenge wasn't in cutting them down. It was in rising so far above that their words no longer reached me. I realized then that the greatest victory was not just proving them wrong but proving myself right, proving that the girl with patched up clothes and shaking hands had always been enough. As I closed the journal and looked out the window at the city lights stretching endlessly into the night, I whispered to myself that their laughter was never the end of my story. It was only the beginning. And now, finally, they knew exactly who I really was.